All right. This is Praveen, Professor of Economics, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and the theme on which I wish to share some thoughts is labor and employment in contemporary India. Before I come to that, I think it's extremely important to think of the larger canvas and the backdrop, which must be kept in view before we come to any particular country. In the last century and a half, there are at least three factors of extreme significance which shape the prospects of labor anywhere and everywhere in the world. Now, these are the following. Number one, the ascendancy and dominance of finance capital, which is a global phenomenon, and it is an entity which possibly is currently the most powerful economic actor in the world. More powerful than the most powerful governments, most powerful corporations. So, as a kind of invisible entity, so to say, this governs a large number of processes and outcomes in the global economy more than anything else. Now, what is this finance capital? Now, this is something which is dramatically different from what Lenin and Hilferding had talked about at the turn of the previous century, that is from 19th to 20th century, where it basically meant coming together of capital in production and capital as finance like nothing before. It was a very powerful unity and coming together of both these branches of capital, which then impacted on the economic outcomes in a synergic fashion. So there was this tremendous synergy between both these, and that is how much of the 20th century, the first half and part of the second half, it was working in tandem with each other, and that is how things were happening. The thing about the contemporary finance capital is that there is a massive disconnect, and it's a kind of a disconnect where there is almost as if finance capital has become completely free from the real economy as such. So things might be happening in a particular way in the real economy, whereas finance capital is going completely elsewhere. This has happened precisely because the current finance capital, the version that we are talking about, is essentially an assemblage of finance, all kinds of instruments as part of the financial infrastructure. Every day you have a number of new instruments which get added to it, which then essentially makes profits through speculation and circulation. So capital as finance has become completely disconnected then from capital in production. So there is that disconnect. The real economy may be moving in one direction, whereas capital as finance is going in a completely different direction, and so on. The implication of it, the most powerful implication of it, there are many implications, but the most powerful implication is that in fact it has tended to create all kinds of difficulties for capital in production. Because if it is easy to make money through casino processes, through speculation, through circulation, etc., there is no reason why capital would want to get into production per se. So there is a strong tendency for capital to kind of get out of production and remain in this very, very speculative kind of sphere, so to say. In fact, Niall Ferguson put it very well when he makes this distinction between planet Earth versus planet finance. So planet Earth consists of all economic activities connected with goods and services, real goods and services, and which would probably be somewhere, as per the current estimates, the valuation of that would be somewhere around, let's say, $70 trillion. Right? So, in terms of real economy, we are talking of the global economy being somewhere around $70 trillion. Whereas, if you look at this planet finance, where basically money chases money, and through that some money is made, right? And a whole lot of derivatives of money through a large infrastructure of instruments and so on and so forth. that is supposedly around more than 1200 trillion US dollars. So we're talking of something which is almost 15 to 20 times more. So planet finance in that sense is almost 15 to 20 times more than the planet Earth, right? And as noted, as mentioned earlier, it basically puts tremendous pressure on planet Earth or real economy, which results in very powerful tendencies towards underconsumption. So if you look at the rate of the growth of GDP and per capita income in real economy in the last, let's say, 30-40 years, and compare that with the preceding 20-30 years, you will find that there is a considerable slowing down. So that is the second point. Number 3, connected with finance, is that it also has given a massive push to a whole lot of processes which accentuate inequality in the global economy or inequity in the global economy. I don't wish to get into that in any great detail here, but these are some of the powerful implications of finance capital. The second major thing which has happened in the recent years is very dramatic changes in information and communication technology, often described as Industry 4, right? Sometimes we call it 4.2 as well. And this essentially has unleashed two kinds of processes. One is very powerful tendencies to displace labor. The second is to connect labor in a global sense. So it's a kind of a labor linking dimension of it. Now what does that mean? You can be based in, let's say, California, get a fairly large number of your economic activities done and executed in India, right? So this is how the labor gets linked through the new technology. So, India became the office of the world. There was no production which was taking place here. But if you look at the top 500 in the Fortune list, almost each one of them had a back office somewhere in India, precisely because of this IT connectivity, right? Now that is something which has the prospect of generating jobs somewhere while jobs are being lost somewhere else, right? Whereas the other process that we talked about, the other dimension that I emphasized, which is displacement. Now, for instance, if you look at the most recent estimate, some 225 robots were put into production 2 years ago, which was almost 30% higher than the number of robots in the preceding year. Now that's a very rapid rate of displacement that we're talking about. So if we take both of these together, then we have to think how is it impacting on employment and the quality of employment, etc. Right? The third major stylized fact, which has huge significance for the world of work globally and in every country, is what has been described variously as global supply chain, global commodity chain, value chain, production networks, etc. I prefer to call this entire process as global value systems. I will not get into a discussion of why I prefer to call it the way what I do, but essentially we understand what it means. For the first time on a very significant scale, there has been transfer of capital in production from global north to global south to select destinations. East Asia has been one of the favorite destinations. Some of it has come to South Asia as well. Textiles, for instance, almost everyone has heard of the unfortunate incident called Rana Plaza and the casualty that it unleashed. So there has been this shift, and there are a number of theories and arguments which try to explain why this has happened. Again, we don't have the time to get into a detailed discussion of it, but simply to flag one of the major factors which has been talked about a great deal, it is on account of global labor arbitrage in terms of costs being cheaper in the global south than in the global north. So to take just one example, if we look at Detroit, which used to be the hub of auto industry about 40 years ago. Today it's Rust Belt. And industries have shifted all over the place. So China, South Korea, East Asia in general. India also has benefited substantially from the relocation of auto in particularly making of parts, etc. in that entire production network. So this again has had very significant implications for labor and employment everywhere, wages and many other dimensions of it. On balance, the most critical dimension of it is that there is a kind of leveling down of the prospects for labor in the global north without really a leveling up in the global south. So if you want to sort of just put it in one sentence, that has been the major outcome of it. Again, we don't have time to get into all the relevant details, but taking these three stylized facts together, then we need to ask, what has this done to the world of labor globally in different regions and in India? Now, it is quite clear, if we go by various reports coming from different quarters, whether it is, let's say, UN agencies like the ILO or other UN agencies, or World Bank reports or IMF report and so on and so forth, from late 80s, early 90s, almost all these have been talking about jobless growth. Now clearly, it has a lot to do with the above noted stylized facts. And there are, of course, additional reasons, and also these stylized facts themselves need to be located in the larger frame of how economies are being managed globally, which is a push towards neoliberal globalization. That also starts from 1970s. So it is within that context that we see a dramatic sort of acceleration, strengthening, etc. of the tendencies, stylized facts that I mentioned earlier. So jobless growth, which basically means what? Even if we have significant increase in output, there are no jobs. Now, across sectors, across countries, what we note is that employment content of output or employment elasticity of output has been going down. Right? This is true almost in every sector and almost in every region, every country of the world. Right? Along with that, there has been very significant acceleration in sort of tendencies like casualization, contractualization, and so on and so forth. In other words, essentially there has been tremendous pressure on the prospects of what we consider decent jobs, decent employment, decent work, etc. Right? Along with that, if we look at what is happening to the legal arrangements which were there and how they are being impacted. So it's not only through some back door that the prospects of decent work are being impacted, but there are dramatic changes in the overall architecture of legal arrangements as regards, protection for workers, policies for workers, etc. And all these are being weakened considerably. So it's not only persistence of informality, it in fact has accentuated the tendency and acceleration of informality almost everywhere. Right? So we have even, let's say, in developed countries, job contracts with zero guarantee of any payment and so on. Right? So through all these multiple processes, what has happened is that the world of work in every which way has come under tremendous pressure, whether it is employment generation, whether it is share of wages and so on. And I just want to give one stat as regards overall wage share. As per a recent study, which looks at set of countries for which there are at least 15 points in last 35 years, 15 years in last 35 years, for which there is comparable data. Now there are 59 such countries for which at least 15 years of data between 75 and 2012 were available, 1975 to 2012, which basically show that in 42 out of these 59 countries, wage share has gone down very, very significantly. In a handful of countries, it is roughly stagnant. And just in a couple of countries, you see that any increase in wage share. Now, globally then, essentially the picture that we get is a kind of, tremendous pressure on the share of wages, which basically means that the share of surplus or share of profit has been going up. Right? Okay, so these are some of the sort of obvious major kind of outcomes which are widely noted, and with that then we can come back to India now. Now, as regards India as part of the BRICS formation, the first point to note would be that the size of the informal or unorganized is much higher in India compared to any of these other countries in BRICS. Of course, China and India account for most of the not only BRICS workforce but the global labor force. In fact, these two countries taken together account for almost 40% of the global workforce and almost 36% of the global population. So of course, what happens in China and India has huge implications for the world of labor in the global economy. But coming back to this informality and precariousness of work in India, as I said, compared to the other four countries, sort of Russia comes with a particular sort of past of where socialism did impact on what would be the future of labor. Same is true of China. Likewise, Brazil has a very different history of economic transformation and industrialization, which is much longer than either India or South Africa. But South Africa had a kind of an enclave economy where a number of sectors which were developed by British capital, and then it had a number of implications for the world of work and world of labor. So given that, you find that the extent of formality as regards outside agriculture, if you're talking of the non-agricultural sector, tends to be much higher than in case of India. So that's the first point that we need to note. Now, coming to India specifically, see, the one major problem is, again, I will not go into a detailed discussion of it, but it is something which is worrying Indian economists a great deal, that the data which can be considered adequate for discussing employment trends is something which is pretty outdated now. The most important, there are multiple sources of data, but the most important one is something called different rounds of employment, unemployment surveys coming from National Sample Survey Organization. Now, as it happens, the last round of this, that is there in public domain, is from 2011-12. Right? Subsequently, there was a lot of discussion whether this serves the policy purpose of getting to know something in real time, etc. And there was a committee set up by the government which decided to change the entire system of data collection and so on. But what will happen, etc., is something which is still uncertain. We know a little bit, but then in terms of large-scale data which was available, the last point is 2011-12. That is a serious problem. Yet, even from that, we get to know a number of things. I'll come to some of the major tendencies emerging from that. Apart from that large source, if there is one other source which can be of giving some insight as regards trends relating to the world of work, it is something called the Labour Bureau data, which tried to provide some substantial information. Now, if we look at both these, based on that, what do we know? Now, just to give you a sense of what has been happening to employment trend in India, if we look at, let's say, 2 points for which we have data from reasonable sources available to us. The last point is 2016, which is from Labour Bureau, Government of India's Labour Bureau. The first point is, we have information from, as I said, National Sample Survey. We also have information from decadal censuses. So if we use, these major sources, then the basic feature which emerges is the following. For the economy as a whole, the rate of growth of employment, okay, the first point, which is 1980-81, total economy taken together, right, and we are looking at more than 20 odd sectors, about 25, 26 sectors, it was 2.42. That was the rate of growth of employment. If we look at 2015-16, for the economy as a whole, it is negative. It's minus 0.08. If we go across sectors, essentially you have most of the sectors either in the red zone, negative, or almost stagnant. There are just a couple of sectors where you see sort of reasonably robust kind of employment growth even now. Compared to 81-82, there is a decline almost in every sector. There is no sector which is, which escapes that, barring maybe one or two. But, in terms of at least generating some employment, you find that, there are at least a couple of sectors which do a reasonable job. Now, what is the message that then we get from it? But before I come to that, let me just give you one or two sectors just to give you an idea. For instance, agriculture, which is the primary sector, where 81-82 it was 1.8, 15-16 it is negative, minus 3.62. Yeah. Likewise, if you look at a sector like let's say transport and storage. In the first year it was 9.30. All these are annual employment growths and so on. And the last year it is 0.60. Right? So you can see dramatic kind of come down and so on. So that is the first thing about what is happening to the labour market in India. Now this is something which connects very well with what I mentioned earlier in the global context, which is employment elasticity more or less crashing. Right? So even if there is growth, we find that prospects of employment generation is something which has come under huge pressure. Right? So the first significant feature that needs to be noticed is this tremendous kind of pressure on employment generation. The second aspect of the recent phase, particularly last 30 odd years or so, is that even those segments which are supposed to be the most privileged segments, these have come under tremendous pressure. Now this shows up very dramatically in share of wages. Right? So we can decompose the total output, total value added, in terms of the share of profit or share of surplus and share of wages. Now if you look at what has happened to the share of wages during the last 30 odd years or so, basically it has been halved. Right? So clearly, it was somewhere around 30%, which came down to about 15% or so. Now this has put tremendous kind of sort of pressure on the overall remunerations, earnings, etc. for workers. And here we are talking about wage workers in particular. In fact, if you look at the most privileged segment of the workforce, namely those who are employed in the so-called formal sector or the organized sector, which is actually very small. If you look at the share of formal or organized workers in India, we are talking of barely 6-7% of the workforce, right? And the wages between 93-94 and 11-12, based on the NSS National Sample Survey data that we mentioned earlier, it has been almost stagnant. In fact, if anything, there has been a slight decline. Right? Now, that is, of course, a cause of huge concern. Right? Likewise, if you look at wages in different sectors in the recent years, in particular, of course, last 30 years we have sub-phases, going up, going down, etc. All that is true. Nonetheless, if you look at the most recent period, for instance, the current phase, sectors which are generating, let's say, relatively more jobs, even in those sectors, there is a tendency for wages to remain flat or to come down. Right? And in a sense, it is a reflection of essentially too many people competing for too few jobs. Right? To use the standard language of the academic, the surplus labor or relative surplus population is something which is continuing to swell, and in such a context, of course, one can expect why something like this is happening. Right? This again is something which is not simply a developing country phenomena. It is something which has been noted for the most powerful economy in the world. Real wages of workers in the US, as Joseph Stiglitz has informed us, between 1967 and 2013, actually there was a small decline in the wages of workers. So this again ties up various parts of the globe in that sense. So this is the second feature. So as regards wages, we find that there is tremendous pressure. The third feature is, again, I mentioned informality earlier. Now what is the indicator of that? In case of Indian economy, the so-called formal sector has higher and higher share of informal workers. Right? So if you look at the proportion of the share of casual workers, contract workers, there is a very significant increase during the last couple of decades in particular, but this is something which starts roughly around, let's say, late 1980s, early 90s onward. Right? So in terms of wages, employment, conditions of work, taking everything together, we notice that the pressure has been increasing, and all this, then not surprisingly, it also comes along with very significant changes in the overall architecture of legal arrangements. So it's not simply some kind of backdoor processes that we are witnessing. Precisely because the underlying economic processes also mean a dramatic rebalancing of class dynamics and class forces. Right? Workers have been pushed to the wall, so to say, right? And because of that balance of class forces changing somewhat post 1980s, when Indian economy decided to, or the policy makers decided to put the Indian economy on fast track of neoliberal reforms, we find that the legal arrangements are also being changed in a manner which are extremely worrisome. So labor laws are being changed. All these are now the so-called labor codes of different kinds, wage code, industrial relations code, etc. The existing labor laws are being amalgamated into 4 broad codes. And this is ultimately trying to level down everything instead of leveling up. Right? So almost, whatever that small segment of the formal workers and the kind of protection that they had, that is something which is likely to go down. It's just a matter of time that all these legal arrangements will be ratified. So the overall conditions of work in that sense has come under huge pressure. And one indicator that numbers sometimes can convey a story very powerfully, which maybe is worth mentioning. In fact, according to official estimates, approximately 10 to 12 million new entrants join the search for work every year in India at the current juncture. Right? 10 to 12 million. Some estimates put it higher, some estimates slightly lower. Right? The jobs generated in 11-12 happen to be approximately 1 million. Right? So 10% of what the number of new entrants is. 15-16, it was 1%. Right? So that is a challenge, which obviously is a most daunting one. Right? Now let me again reiterate that there is a lot of noise as regards which data to look at. Do we have appropriate data to sort of swear by some numbers, etc. Of course, there is a problem there. Yet, to the extent that what economists or most economists would consider relatively more reliable data, as I said, the most reliable one stops at 11-12, which was based on household surveys. Right? After that, what we have, each one of these sources has relatively less credibility. Whatever it has, based on that, the trends which are emerging seem to be extremely worrisome. Right? India, I think again everyone knows, has been the second fastest growing economy over a period of almost 4 decades now, second to China. Right? Of course, during this entire 4-decade period, China has grown at a rate which was approximately 40% higher than India. Right? Now, if with that kind of growth, right, being the second fastest economy in the world, if there are no prospects of employment, right, then one needs to rethink the entire sort of narrative of growth and structure of growth, etc. And let me make one final point. This is something which I should have mentioned earlier as regards some of the trends relating to the Indian economy. India has this dubious distinction of having one of the lowest workforce participation for women. Right? And again, there is a lot of debate why we have something like that. South Asia and Middle East tend to be particularly worse in this respect. But even countries like Bangladesh are doing much better than India in this respect as regards labour force participation of women. What is particularly worrying is that in the most recent period, again that has tended to come down from already a low base to something which seems extremely difficult to comprehend. Why is it that we have such dramatic declines in employment of women now, which of course then raises major questions as regards empowerment of women, the prospects of not only their livelihood but overall empowerment in a social political sense as well. Now these are questions which again need to be factored in when we talk of the overall world of work, labour and employment in the Indian context. Right? India to me seems to be doing much worse than in terms of let's say the basic markers. Right? So if you look at the floor of wages, for instance, what we have, let's say, in Russia or China or Brazil or South Africa, compared to that in terms of very basic sort of flow, India seems to be in a much worse state in spite of this, so-called impressive growth for so many years. Likewise, if you look at protection, either, let's say, we can talk about what has happened in South Africa in terms of the pension, the social security and pension, what that does to at least those who were workers yesterday and maybe out of that now, and so on. We don't have any such thing on any significant scale. We have tokenism of various kinds. So if we start looking at, in a disaggregated fashion, the different constitutive elements of both quantitative, qualitative, etc., of the world of work, I think India's story seems to be much grimmer than the other countries in the BRICS formation. Thank you for your attention.